someone's written in and would like to have your wisdom on this particular issue. The question is framed this way: what are your thoughts on the Second Commandment? Is it appropriate to view or to create images of Christ?
Oh, that's two different questions, but I'll try to relate to both of them. I get a lot of questions about my views on the Second Commandment, particularly because of anybody who's ever been to St. Andrew's, where we worship, because there is an abundance of art. In the narthex, we have 5 large paintings by a painter from Florence, Italy, who has been heralded by some experts as the leading religious painter of the 20th century. We have stained glass windows, of course, in the sanctuary. We have a cross on the communion table. And there are reasons for that. But people come to me and they say, well, wait a minute, doesn't the Second Commandment prohibit the use of art in places of worship? Now, historically, there have been a lot of people in the Reformed tradition who do believe that the Second Commandment prohibits the use of any kind of artistic ornamentation in the context of corporate worship. And they see the paintings as such as violating the principle prohibiting the making of graven images. If we use the basic principle of interpreting the Scripture by the Scripture, I think that this objection against art falls by its own weight, for the simple reason is that when we do find God establishing principles and patterns of worship in the Old Testament, particularly when he gives the detailed instructions for the building first of the tabernacle and then of the temple, he goes into elaborate detail in commanding the functioning and fashioning of vessels and other principles of furnishings and so on for the sake of beauty, where he tells us that these things are made for beauty and for holiness, even down to the patterns for the robes of Aaron and the priesthood, which incidentally God commanded that they be adorned with such things as representations of pomegranates, blue pomegranates. This may have been the birth of Impressionism or Expressionism, because where did you ever see a blue pomegranate in the history of art? But also in the Holy of Holies, you have the mercy seat, and it is guarded, as it were, by the figures of the cherubim. So, here we see art commanded by God as integral to the fashioning of the tabernacle and, as I said later, the temple. I think what the Second Commandment prohibits is the making of graven images for the purpose of worshiping the image. That is, that I see the Second Commandment as a strong prohibition against all forms of idolatry. We know that Calvin in the 16th century was perhaps even more zealous about reforming the worship of the church than he was reforming the doctrine of the church. And he said that our basic constituent nature of fallen humanity is that we are a fabricum idolorum. We're idol factories. We mass produce our factories. And in his reaction against the use of images in the worship of Rome, he was so concerned that those practices that had crept into the church be reformed that he wanted a temporary, at least, moratorium against the use of any kind of adornment or artwork or images, icons, any of that sort of thing, in order to break people's habits from being addicted to an idolatrous use of these things. But even Calvin believed that images of earthly personages and events were legitimate for art forms, which would include, by extension, I believe, representations of the human Jesus. I don't see anything contrary to the biblical prohibition there of images of Paul or of Peter or of Andrew or of the human Jesus. One of the earliest discoveries of Christian art were drawings on the walls of the catacombs, which included in the first one discovered a presentation of the baptism of Jesus by John in the Jordan River. So from the earliest days of the Christian community, there was a tacit understanding that representations of the human Jesus were legitimate. Even in the Reformation, the logo of the 16th century Reformation was the burning bush, which was a theophany, which was a visible manifestation of the invisible God. But I think what is prohibited is any attempt to try to paint or carve an image of God Himself. Not just I think it'd be fine to have a picture of a pillar of smoke or a pillar of fire, any one of these historical theophanies, but to try to capture the essence of the being of God Himself through art, I think would violate the Second Commandment. There's a lot more that can be said about this, but that's my basic view of it.